Dude, what are you? You're on like 45 different medicines over here.
Yeah. I got an ear infection swimming in a cave in Mexico.
I mean, of all the infections you could have got on your Mexican vacation, ear is pretty good.
It's true. It's true. There are much worse infections you can get from Mexico. Yeah, I dove into a cave. I jumped off of a cliff. It was one of those two things. I jumped off of a bridge in Abu Dhabi, and that was the first time my left ear started bothering me. That was like 5 years ago, and ever since then, it just sometimes I might have done structural damage to it. I'm not sure.
Every time you jump off something into water, you have to deal with this.
You would think I would learn my lesson, but it was fun. It was worth it. Cave diving was actually really cool. It's like there was times when I was big too. Everyone was like, "How is Sam going to make it through that?" And you're like kind of facing the up, and you have to like the cave comes. You basically almost go underwater and like hold your breath, but it's very tight, and it's like kind of claustrophobic.
Is it dark?
It's completely pitch black. Well, he has a headlamp on your guide, but a couple times you turn it off, and then it's just like it's pitch black. Also, there's like bats down there. So then he turns it on, and you're looking up, and there's like a hole, and there's like 8 bats just hanging out.
It was worth it?
Oh, it was so awesome. It was like the coolest thing we did.
Oh, cool.
They also have a part, because like there's jaguars in Mexico, and they go in these caves sometimes, and there's this one part where you turn, the girls went first, and he said, "Oh, what's that?" And he's showing the light over there, and they have like a you know, paper mache or whatever it is, ceramic jaguar like right there, and they screamed so loud. It was so funny. I was like pretty impressed that they would do that. It was pretty good, but it was pretty freaky too. You're down there, and there's this like life-size, you know, model jaguar staring at you. It's pretty cool though.
Nice.
It was fun. Water's like super clear, you know. There's like pigmentless fish down there and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of little fish that start nibbling at your feet, the kind that they have in spas. So you're just like hanging out in there, and then
They're
you see
like
a group of
cleaning your
them.
feet.
Yeah, and one of them gets bold enough to take a bite, and then he's like, "Oh, I like that," and then all of them just start kind of going on your feet. It's pretty gnarly.
Is there like there's not a chance of like damage here?
No,
right?
no.
Okay.
No. Although I do follow this account on Twitter called Nature is Scary, and they showed this group of fish destroying like this octopus, and I'm glad I saw that after I got back from Mexico. So, yeah, it was a good trip, though. I didn't get sunburn. I learned how to use sunscreen.
Nice.
Now I just have to learn how to not get an ear infection. You've been working on some stuff this week?
Yeah, I've been doing a bunch of Ember Rails development. I feel like I hit like a lot of issues, but I got a lot of like good things to talk about out of it. So figure we could go through some of those.
What's your overall opinion of the week? Like thumbs up or thumbs down on technology and being a programmer?
Thumbs up.
Okay, cool.
Thumbs
cool.
up, yeah.
So it's not like a bunch of rants. It's not.
I mean, I can still rant about it,
sure,
right?
But it's not. You weren't frustrated overall. You were like excited by what you were working on and the progress you made.
Yes,
cool
for sure. I guess the first thing, it's like we had this conversation earlier in the week, but it was super valuable for me, was we had upgraded an Ember app. It was like 3.1 or 3.0, and we went to 3.4. We just did to the next LTS, and we used some of your workflow of basically upgrading all the add-ons first, because add-ons are really good at being backwards compatible, then upgrading like the Ember things, and then kind of dealing with any deprecation warnings from there. And I ran a situation that I haven't run into before, which is all the add-ons upgraded, or at least the ones that we could, upgraded all the Ember stuff. That went fine. And there were some add-ons that we couldn't upgrade because they aren't maintained anymore. And so when you run yarn upgrade interactive, these add-ons don't show up because there is no new version to upgrade to. But they started throwing.
So you're on latest. What's the problem?
Exactly. We're on latest. It's just from 2016. So we got those upgraded, and then I ran the test suite, and they started throwing a whole bunch of deprecations. And I had a question that there was a discussion where it's like, what do you do in this situation? These add-ons are unmaintained. Do you like fork the add-on, fix the deprecations, and then point your package.json at the fork? You know, there's trade-offs there. Or do you just ignore the deprecations and basically like this at some point will break my app, but I'm not going to worry about it because it's like out of my control because this add-on is unmaintained. And there's definitely trade-offs with that one.
Just to be a little more concrete, let's say an add-on used send action, which was a conventional best practice in 2016, and send action, the API, which is an internal API to Ember, is deprecated. And so that's within, it's the add-on is calling to an Ember API that has become deprecated.
Yes, exactly. And that was actually an example of this. In 3.1, it's totally fine to call send action. But in 3.4, send action throws a deprecation, and send action will be removed from the framework in 4.0.
So you start seeing messages that say, my old add-on is calling send action in your console.
Exactly. And for like big add-ons that have like a lot of this, they very quickly overwhelm your console. So my initial thing was like, oh, this send action is a really like easy thing to fix. You just find where it's calling send action and you invoke the method. It's like a pretty straightforward fix. I don't really have to understand the add-on to fix that. There's no like architectural change there. So my initial reaction was, okay, I'll just fork this add-on, fix all this, and then point our package.json at the forked add-on, which is like under our repo, under our control. But you had a good point about this. Why I shouldn't do that.
Which was?
So now I'm learning I probably shouldn't take your advice. No, you said that
it becomes your responsibility.
As soon as I do that, now I'm on the hook for maintaining this add-on.
Right. It reminds me of what Katie said during our interview, which is basically when she sees an add-on that doesn't have tests, she considers it something that she'll eventually have to maintain. This is like another version of that, even if it has tests, but it's already become unmaintained. If you're going to continue to rely on it, then it becomes your responsibility.
Yeah. So the other option there, that since I don't want to maintain this add-on, I mean, really, I can't maintain it. This is like
and the other add-on. Right. And the other way we had thought about it was like fast forward a couple years, like go to the logical conclusion of this when Ember 4 is out. Like, what do you do then? So that kind of tells you this duct tape solution or the temporary fix of forking it and stuff. If there's not an owner who is actively merging PRs to fix things like that, then it's just going to be, a losing game sooner or later.
Yeah. Take it to its logical conclusion. I mean, I guess if Ember 4 came out and there was some feature in Ember 4 that like we needed to take advantage of, I would fork the add-on. I think, from like being a good developer, I think getting off this add-on would be a blocker for upgrading to 4.0.
Right.
In reality, things don't always work out like that.
But basically that's the alternative is to like refactor away from the add-on.
Yep. Now for today, this week, I couldn't refactor away from this add-on. That was, we needed to get to 3.4 for some stuff, and it's a big add-on. It's used in multiple places. Yeah. And I was uncomfortable refactoring away this week.
Right.
What I ended up doing was ignoring the deprecations. And I was a little like on the fence about this because I was worried that like, hey, these are like warning you about problems that you're definitely gonna face in the future, and you're just hiding this.
And we've talked before about. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, I was gonna say someone's gonna go upgrade to 4.0, and the app is just gonna not work.
Yeah,
and they're gonna be like, "Why isn't this working?"
Yeah, we've talked before about also treating like warnings as errors.
Yeah,
Yes, and that's something. I think that's like an ideal and something that you can, when it comes to the pragmatics, you can pursue in various degrees depending on the constraints of your situation and the team you're working on, the app you're working on.
Yeah. And I think like in this situation, I definitely can make a good case for getting off this add-on and treating these warnings as errors, especially because like we don't, this team that I'm working with, we don't want this to bite us in the random future when 4.0 gets released. So we know about this now. We can basically plan out over the next year a point to refactor it out. So yeah.
So that was your solution. So then how did you communicate the knowledge that you've done this thing?
Yeah. So
to future developer X who's going to be responsible for upgrading.
So two things. One is in our like project management software, I made a ticket upgrading to Ember 4.0. And I said, don't worry, Ember 4.0 isn't out yet.
Right.
But when we do upgrade, this is going to be the card that who's ever working on this is going to take on, and here's what you need to know. And I referenced that this add-on has its deprecations ignored. It's broken or it's unmaintained. Here's like a link to the PR that fixes it, but since it's unmaintained, that PR isn't getting merged. If it does get merged, this comment can just disappear.
Right.
So that's a way of just kind of communicating to the team. I also found and used Ember deprecation workflow, which is an add-on by Maxonic, Matt, and it's awesome. It lets you run your test suite. It captures all the deprecations.
So just stepping back a little bit, the first thing is that when you start hitting these deprecations, your console fills up, and even if it's just one API that's being used, if like a component is being called a million times, your console's going to get overwhelmed with like these warning errors and messages that are basically not actionable from your perspective.
And we write a lot of acceptance tests. So every acceptance test that hits this page that's using this add-on is going to fill the console. So it's overwhelming.
So the deprecation workflow was originally created, I think, from 113 to 2.
Yep.
Or 112 to 113 maybe, because of all the deprecations that were introduced, and it just helps teams go through them systematically. So
you run your test suite, you get, your console fills up with deprecation warnings. They give you a command that you run, and it generates a config file that you then drop into Ember CLI. And then now the next time you run your test suite based on that configuration file, it's just going to hide all those deprecation warnings. And so you can open up this config file, and you can kind of see, okay, here's all the deprecations, and it's not every deprecation is just one entry in this config file. So no matter how many times the component's rendered, just one entry. We probably had thousands of console warn deprecation warnings. There were literally 2 deprecations.
Yeah.
So
that's pretty good.
Yeah. So it's nice. It lets you configure, like, should this deprecation be shown? Should it be hidden? Should it throw an error? So it's really nice. You can, the workflow here is you can now tackle these deprecations one at a time. And I'll get into kind of that in a second.
Cool.
But yeah, it's great that you have this configuration file. I also referenced that in the ticket that, for upgrading. It's basically like when you're going to go to upgrade to 4.0, just be aware that this is what we're hiding.
Yep.
So the workflow is you now go into this file, everything's hidden, and you can just take the first deprecation you see and you can change it to throw so it like fails your test. I changed it to log or warn. I think it's a log. So I could see it in the console, but I knew that this was the only one I was going to see. And also when it logs, it takes up less space. It just does one line that you can open up. So it's a little less, even though you're going to get a lot of them, it's a little less overwhelming. And I went through and I kind of, originally there's like send action deprecation is, it's like send action. I don't just want to hide all the send actions, because if send action is coming from this add-on, this unmaintained add-on, I want to ignore that one. But if send action is coming from our app, I want to fix that.
Right.
So I kind of went through them, figured out the ones that were coming from our app, fixed those. And then in the deprecation thing, you can actually like hide based on the message. So I put the name of the add-on in the message.
Because it's part of the message.
Because it's part of the message. So that way, if any developer uses send action, they'll get the deprecation warning. So I thought that was awesome. Once I kind of cleaned this up and I got this, I was like, okay, I'm only going to hide these.
Yep. That's great.
Yeah, you can match against a regex string.
It's like catching a known error, basically.
Yeah. Yep.
And letting other errors still bubble.
Yep.
Cool.
And then I kind of like just went through this file. I said there were 2 warnings. So the send action was the first, and the other was, I think like Ember had like a copyable mixin, and that's now been moved to it's still in the framework, but it throws a warning. It's now been moved to an add-on, and that was super easy to fix. So I changed all those to log, found the places we were using copyable, and you just import it. You install an add-on, you import copyable from the add-on, and that's it. You're done.
What does that do? That was a first-party mixin?
Yeah, I think it's like object assign or object merge into like an empty hash. It just copies the properties.
Gotcha.
We were using it. I think there's like a batch update adapter thing that was using it to like copy props out
I see.
to post. It's pretty cool. I didn't actually have to understand
That is cool.
what was going on.
Very cool.
You know, I knew the fix. I found the fix in the deprecation guides, had the log in the deprecation workflow, got them all fixed, and I could just delete that line.
That's great.
So the workflow,
Yeah.
like this workflow of tackling one deprecation at a time and going through of like log and then tweaking the regex to match what you want. It's pretty awesome workflow. Like when I got done with this, I was like, man, that felt really good.
You always knew what the next step was, and you weren't just hit with like, oh, I'm just going to ignore all this like console mess.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah. And by the end of the day, there's no more deprecations in them.
That's
awesome.
awesome.
Not true. There are deprecations. They're just hidden.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, there's no more deprecations that like the dev team needs to worry about.
Right.
Because the ones that are there, they're out of our control.
The actionable ones were taken care of,
Yeah.
and then the non-actionable ones were hidden.
Yeah. And it's really,
That's awesome.
workflow is such a good word to
Yeah.
describe this add-on, because it's like, yeah, it's like you said, there's actual items, there's next steps. You're never like, oh boy, got to Google what to do here. Let me find like this old GitHub issue. There's none of that. It's like very, it's almost like a therapeutic. It's just, you just
Therapeutic refactoring or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
you just go through this and
Yeah.
you get done and you're like, man, this is like,
It's cleaned up. You cleaned house.
yeah.
It's also just amazing the fact that you have that cohesive story across the whole ecosystem. You know, I know that's something I would miss and have missed every time I've not worked in Ember. Even though add-ons are written by different people, we have that unified deprecate helper, and so that enables tools like this. You know, it's really cool.
Yeah.
I had some other thoughts when you were speaking earlier. One is like if you find yourself in this situation where you're using something that's deprecated, like, you know, sometimes we talk about code debt and technical debt, and, you know, there's kind of different takes on that. And it's like, if, you know, Glimmer components come out and they're the new way to do it, does that mean all of our, you know, component.extend code is like tech debt? Well, like you could certainly argue that, but on the other hand, it's like that code works, and, you know, we kind of believe in refactoring as part of work that we're doing. We don't really think you should, as much as possible, have like a refactoring task that you have to explain the value of to your product manager. You should just be doing that as it makes sense and as you're working on something that's painful. So like there's an argument that those old style components are not tech debt, right? Whereas this feels like truly tech debt. Like if you're relying on an add-on that has like basically a lifespan that's like ticking down, it's debt. It's just because and it could continue to work until a certain point in time when you know it's not going to, and no one's maintaining that. That's like, that feels like tech debt in like the most real sense of the word.
Yeah.
And you could imagine explaining the value of like refactoring away that to like your team, as opposed to like most kind of mundane refactoring and test writing. All that should be like bundled up with a feature, I think.
I 100% agree. I think you should always go into those conversations with like this is a value that it adds to the project.
Right.
So I would still have kind of that in my back pocket. It might be something like, look,
well, why are we upgrading now
Yeah.
to 4?
Yes.
And it's because of X. And so this is a part of that.
And it could also be something like, look, through the history of this application, we've always wanted to upgrade as new versions come out.
Right.
Because new versions unlock new things. And
Right.
we don't necessarily know what 4.0 is going to unlock.
Right.
But we know we don't want to be blocked for 6 months.
Right.
And so to keep the dev workflow,
Right.
Moving forward.
Right.
And I think most people will buy that. And again, I still like to tie it to a feature.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's still awesome when you can say, look, and this is you user of the application. This is what you'll be allowed to do.
Right.
Totally. Yeah.
Maybe like using Ember animated, and you couldn't do that before because you're on some older version. And so now you can tie that to something, right?
And it's like if your like backlog is full of like upgrade database,
Yes.
upgrade servers, to change deployment, like that's just going to overwhelm the non-technical users of your team, and it's going to push them out of any sort of like road mapping conversation. So I think like one or two of these, like, oh, we need to get rid of deprecations, and it's like one thing that's kind of on its own is a lot easier.
Or ideally attached as like a checklist item of a feature.
I mean, that's like the ideal workflow is definitely that.
That's a really great point. I know this is all stuff that I learned from you when we started working together, but I think it's super important for people to hear this because if you are complaining that your boss is not giving you time to write tests or refactor or clean up tech debt, that's on you, buddy. That's not on your boss. That's your responsibility as a professional to know how to, estimate the total cost of a new feature and how to keep things clean. And like the idea that you're going to get all this time set aside to do refactoring or tests, like maybe every once in a while people do that during like a hack day or something, but that's not a good part of a healthy, normal development workflow.
Yeah, nights and weekends.
Yeah, exactly.
Seriously.
Exactly. The other one other thing here was that if the add-on is not ever going to be changed, that's a pretty rare situation where you're like, okay, we just need this PR merge to account for send action, and the person's just completely fallen off the map. I know Ember has an adopted add-ons repository. I think even one of our old add-ons that we weren't working on anymore, but that other people were still relying on, is in there. And that's a very important thing that's turned out to be good, because it's just funny. If you have like, EmberMap / Ember collapsible panel, it's just like that's someone else's thing, but a lot of people are using that. If it's like an adopted add-on, people are going to be much more likely to contribute to it because it doesn't feel like you're just doing someone else's dirty work. You're not taking out someone else's trash, like you're doing open source contribution.
Well, also too, adopted add-ons repo has a whole bunch of people with commit access.
Yes.
Where
yes.
EmberMap doesn't, even though we would grant it to people.
Right. That's just, we don't want to block all of them on that stuff.
Someone would have to like do the work. They would PR it, ask for commit. We'd give it to them. But this other adopted add-ons is like, it's inverted. People have commit.
Right.
Add-ons show up there. They fix them. So yeah.
Right.
That's actually a good action item for me. I should.
If the person's not responsive, then like bring it up with the learning team and the people doing the adopted add-on stuff and see if you can get it moved over there, because that would be the easiest thing.
Yeah.
And then also like related to our conversation on upgrading, like I think the way you handled it makes sense because, do you immediately do all the work to like get off the thing? No. Do you like fork it immediately? I think opening the issue someone else, it could be solved upstream in some way. And so if you're an app developer who is crunched, often like you'll revisit these sorts of things in a month and there'll be something, a code mod thing that can help, or a polyfill. Maybe there's like a send action polyfill that even if you went to 4, you install that and it actually doesn't block you. So, there's things like that can come about.
Great point. Yeah. This add-on, although it's a deprecation, still works today.
Right.
And there's a big buffer of time for some solution to get unstuck.
Right. Exactly. The last thing that it made me think of was, one thing we've talked about with the upgrades is like, this has even happened with projects that we basically have full control over. And it's like, you don't want upgrades to be a big deal. And if you come across something that's just a showstopper like this, and now you have an issue that's like upgrade Ember 4 and you have a to-do item on it that's like, oh, by the way, whoever gets stuck with this is going to have to deal with my fancy widget add-on that's like completely busted and used everywhere. Now it feels like maybe people will start adding things to that list, and the chore of upgrading from 3 to 4 is going to become bigger and bigger. And that's actually exactly what we want to avoid.
Yeah.
Like we want our tools and our community practices should be encouraging people to do things as continuously and ongoing as possible to make event upgrades like a non-event, basically. That's like where the upgrade process comes in, Dependabot comes in, backwards compatibility comes in, incremental adoption. I think it's like super important. We're still figuring that out and we still haven't nailed that, but that's like something else I just thought of. So like it's good to have an answer for every contingency that fits in this process,
That's a great point. It's a really good point, because I could totally see this upgrading to 4
blossoming.
Yeah. And so it's almost like you want, maybe this like also gets put out in another task. And
right. Maybe the polyfill thing is like, ideally you want a way that's like deals with it today that doesn't block anyone on anything in the future, so that everything can nothing piles up, But all that to say, I think everything we discussed is like pretty good solution, and like just makes me grateful too that we're in a community that values that stuff. So that's basically taken care of for us. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know even you've told me stories of like Rails upgrades back in the day. You'd set aside like weeks, and it's not what you want ideally.
No, and it also like going back to like the product people and the customers and your users, It's the last thing they want
Yes.
to hear. They have a list that's 2 miles long of features they want built.
Exactly.
Tell them you're upgrading.
Yeah. Exactly.
Wait, are we allowed to swear on this?
I actually love using that bleep sensor in Final Cut Pro.
Nice.
It'll just make you sound like a total badass. Imagine being a product person who's worked on teams, and you come to one now. You look back and you realize you've been doing product work for 2 years, and the dev team never asked you to stop to like migrate a database or upgrade that. That's an awesome feeling. You want that, for your team.
Yeah, I've noticed on teams I've been on that have that, it's also like you talk about like inclusivity and getting ideas from everyone on the team. When you have a bunch of things in the backlog that are dev related, the people that aren't developers show up to those meetings and their eyes just gloss over and they check out.
It's wrong. It's wrong to bring that stuff to those meetings.
Yeah.
It's totally wrong.
And so getting folks all speaking the same language is just so powerful.
Yes.
And as a developer, like you actually want other people's input because you don't know what you're going to go off and build the wrong thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so this helps you, the developer, like massively.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. That's cool. I know you have some more stuff. While you pull it up, I don't know how long this is, but I've been working with a team, one of the teams we work with, and one of the designers actually knows quite a bit about handlebars and like basic JavaScript stuff, and he's like firmly a designer, but he's in the Ember code base. He runs it locally, and he is able to like design in HTML and CSS. And when the Ember engineers take it over, it's like basically ready to go from the static template. Not even just static. It has like JavaScript arrays, let's say. So the Ember engineer's job is like wiring up to the real data calls and dealing with the asynchronicity and the action handling and all that stuff. But I was really surprised and impressed by that too. It's like if people can design and do the stuff we do, like what's going to be left for us?
Yeah, well, that I think whatever episodes ago we talked about how like design is a super valuable skill, and this is kind of like proof of that. That like the engineering stuff is going away, or it's or at least there's a middle ground they can share.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was really cool, and it's also like I know Steve Shoger has been learning Tailwind in HTML and CSS. And so if designers are starting to like do their job in these tools, it's pretty interesting. When you come from the development side, you're like, start using Sketch. You're like, oh, this is so cool. It's so much easier. Why can't I just make it work here? And it's almost like you see the limitations of your tool and you want the benefits of Sketch. The Steves of the world are living and breathing in Sketch, and then they see the limitations of those tools and they really want, I really want to just see what it looks like in a browser when I resize the window. So I'm just going to use that. So that I found that interesting. And if more and more designers are trying to use like higher fidelity tooling that's like closer to the code, it kind of made me question if my mental guess, my mental prediction about the future of building UIs looks very different was true or not.
I mean, maybe there's like this middle ground, and this middle tooling that's
code behind, like WinForms. You drag a table, but then you can double click it, and you just see all the code for it.
Hey, not complaining.
Actually, you know what? Actually, that's actually not even that far off, because if you look at the Swift UI, I follow this guy who's doing a course on Swift UI, and it's just ridiculous. And he has like the thing right here and over here, and it's not like Sketch in the way that it's like drag and drop vector, but you actually do like you do like command space, and you say I want like a 3D rotate, and you drag it on your card, and then the code appears here, and you like hover. It's like interactive code. It's like living code. It's really cool. So like maybe that's closer, because he obviously is technically literate, but I don't think he has done a bunch of engineering, but he's able to tweak the parameters and stuff that basically I think any designer would be capable of learning. Nice. So that's pretty interesting. But they have this designer that works locally. They have their app pointing to production data for helping him build the dynamic pieces. And so I asked about that, of course, because I work on Mirage, and I'm so curious because this is like one use case for it. And it's always this tension between like, the production data is the highest fidelity. Even sometimes when we work on EmberMap, we proxy to production because I just want to see what it looks like with my little code change. But then it's also very nice to use Mirage so that you can say, oh, let me just give me a subscribed user, give me an anonymous user. And if you're proxying to production, that can be hard for a variety of reasons, especially if you're working on like a data-driven app that has like n different scenarios and you need to create something just for you. So that just made me want even more there to be like one way to do it, and for there not to be this trade-off where it's like, oh, I would use Mirage, but it's like annoying to maintain this stuff. Like, what if there's just an easier way, even a UI for defining these data scenarios or ingesting them from production and then just tweaking them and throwing it away, something like that. I think that would be such a cool future, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
But he felt very empowered. He said it was the best setup he's ever had as a designer, having the local environment that's proxying to production, and it worked out in such a way that the production data was basically what he needed to do his job, and he was very happy with it. So he didn't have that pain point. I kind of asked if there's times where production data doesn't have the scenario you need to design, and he said when it doesn't happen often. When it does, I'll just make like a local JavaScript object with like the properties I need.
Cool. Do you see?
I think that can break down in a lot of apps where it's complex and relationships and stuff like that, but for him that worked.
Do you see him becoming more of an Ember developer, or do you see like a hard boundary that like, no, he's never going to write like component code?
Yeah.
Like what are your thoughts?
That's a good question, because when he told me he was like passing JavaScript objects into his like templates and stuff, and I was like, oh, okay, he's like not just a designer. Like, I don't say that disparagingly, but he's also
just admit you hate designers.
He's also, I hate them because they can do something I have a hard time with. He also is like doing front end development. He was, and he was like adding new routes and stuff like that. So he basically is like a lightweight front end developer at this point, right? And so then the question is like, how many designers are like this or will be like this versus him maybe just being more of a like a polyglot, when it comes to his skill set in this world. So yeah, it's interesting. But I really I do think that there is a better future where the data creation story looks better. And I like thinking about the constraints of building it for someone who is not a front-end developer who wants an intuitive way to create dummy scenarios, because I feel like that would lead to a solution that's better for both developers and non-developers.
I mean, I'm not a designer and I would use that. So.
Right, exactly.
Cool.
What you got next? Anything else?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You got a list?
Now we're moving to the rant portion of the podcast. I worked on a few different apps this week, and every app that I worked on it was like two apps, and it was like painfully two apps. So it was like Ember front end, Node back end. Two of them were Ember front ends, Rails back ends, and it's not even from the code. We talk about like two apps from like the code point of view and the complexity, but just like there's like issues on GitHub. Which repo are they in? You open a PR for the front end and for the back end, and they're related. You don't really merge one without the, even though you could merge one without the other, they're related. They're coupled to the same feature. And so that you end up like cross-linking, like, oh, here's the UI PR, here's the back end PR. Like you link the GitHub tickets. There's like a project management software where you link to like the front end ticket, you link to the, and it's just, it made me think like, the deployment process. So even though like we have automatic deploys, so as soon as you merge a PR, it gets deployed. To go actually like watch the deploys, you log into like you log into like a dashboard for the back end, and then I have to like log into a dashboard for the front end, and I kind of have both of them up and I'm watching them. And it made me think like we're developing two apps, but it's really one. It's real at the end of the day, we're building one thing.
Totally.
And all this stuff is disconnected.
And a single consumer.
Yes.
You're backend as a single consumer.
Yeah. But everything from the code to the project management, just the GitHub workflow, it's all disconnected.
Yeah, it's bad. Because you think about, if you're describing it, you would see one line that's going through.
Yeah.
You would put one line. The front end's merged, the back end's merged, the front end's deployed, the back end's deployed, now we can visit the site. It's all one thing.
Yes. And so and there are like workflows for like doing like the zero downtime deploys, and we do all those. to get this right. But it's just the fact that you're
it's
using
leaky
like two
abstraction.
different.
It's leaking everywhere in terms of
all these tools are made for like one repo. One like
one deployed.
The way we define an app in these tools is per repo, but that's not now the way we look at these. Is we have two repos to represent one app.
Right.
And so it's like I want a tool that accounts for all this.
That's interesting.
That's
interesting.
It was just like it wasn't even like a code thing that was frustrating me. It was like the process and the tooling around this.
Yeah. So what about like Next and Netlify, who have like N apps within a single repo that is one conceptual app? I guess they just take care of it for you, because if you have like if you have like cloud functions and in your root, and those get deployed as part of doing a static build of your front end and deploying it to Amazon or whatever it is, the CDN, I guess you as a user, you just don't care. So that's like pretty cool.
And but we've kind of talked about like, well, you make a CSS change and then like your whole backend gets deployed. That's why you want it as like separate apps. So there's benefits to the separate app thing. Right. I was kind of like just imagining like what I would want here, and it's like I want something like a project management tool or board that has multiple like repos or multiple apps inside of it, and I could like cross. It's very easy to like link up to PR. Like if I have a backend PR and a front end PR and they're related to the same feature, it's like I want just some way to those things to be linked.
I wonder if you need that flexibility, or if just a mono repo would actually be better if tools like Heroku worked with subdirectories. Because in a mono repo, you have literally no dependency drift because it's all one thing, which is kind of makes sense if you think about it, because there's one consumer, one interface. There's one interface for one consumer.
Yes. So from the GitHub point of view, yes, mono
front end
repo
folder, back end folder, let's say.
For like the Heroku thing, I'd still have like two apps. Two like Heroku apps.
Yeah, your back end can go down while your front end's not down.
Yeah.
Like
so
but
like,
that's like
it would be hard to like overview them.
Well, think about a Rails app. You actually have a database server, so you have two servers.
I guess Heroku doesn't separate those. Like the database is within my Rails application.
But your database could go down while your Rails server is still running.
Sure.
What happens then?
You get 500 errors. No. You could, but from like the workflow point of view, I would like open up the Rails app on Heroku and then go into the database and see the database size.
Okay. So that's like a UI problem. You're saying.
Group this as one conceptual app. It's like listed under the Rails app, where I want like
that's what you want for, let's say, EmberMap, and you can see now under EmberMap you see the front and the back end. The database you see.
And Heroku does have a way to like group multiple apps into like an organization, but there's no
that linear timeline that spans multiple servers. You don't have that. Or multiple apps. You don't have that.
And I think this is going to become more of a thing.
Interesting.
As we this two app thing isn't going away. Whether it goes into mono repo or not.
It's because the one app has a dependency on the other app, right? If it didn't, or if there were other apps that had a dependency on the back end, you would want to potentially see the back end on its own. But in this case, because there's exactly one consumer that has a dependency on it, it doesn't make sense to look at the front end without the back end, and it doesn't make sense to look at back end without the front end. Back end without the front end. So that's kind of an interesting use case.
If you asked users of this application how many apps we have, they would say one. It's conceptually it's one app.
Right.
And so I want to see the project management tied to both of these repos. I want an easy way to cross link. Yeah, it's just
interesting.
So it's just one of those things. It's like I don't see this problem
friction
going away.
Because you actually see it getting bigger because of the architecture, popular architecture pattern. I was thinking about the dashboard app we built, React and Node. And we built it in React and Mirage, and then we wanted the back end, and we didn't want to just make a whole Rails server because we just didn't want to. And we also want to eventually practice sharing the Mirage logic potentially. So we just made a Node script. It's like 80 lines of code, and it powers the whole thing. It's in a folder, like a subdirectory of it. And how do we do deploys there? We push and it just deploys them both. There's no like dependency thing.
You're right. We have two. So
two Heroku apps. No,
it's one Netlify app for the front end, and then a Heroku app for the back end,
for the Node
and then
server.
Each like Netlify. There's two. It's like NPM scripts. So there's like a Yarn back end and a Yarn front end. Yarn
Yarn build.
Yeah, so Yarn front end is like Yarn build,
Right.
create React app.
Right.
And then the back end is just like node server.js.
Right.
Which
With
spins up the
production or
server.
something like that or whatever.
Yep.
So that's
But
that feels a lot more lightweight. And then we have a database that is just
within the Heroku app.
and that doesn't on deploy, nothing changes there. With Rails, does it? What does Rails do when you deploy a new version? Like let's say you push code to Rails and you do it, by default it won't change the database. It won't like restart the database server.
No.
What if you change the database in some way?
So it's pretty common for like deploying Rails apps on Heroku. You have a release phase, and Heroku has like an awesome their workflow. They've thought through so much of this stuff. It's amazing. So highly recommend reading it. But part of the release phase would be like pushing assets to a CDN or running database migrations. So they give you this chunk. It's like you build your app, and then with the built app, you release it. So you run the migrations, and then you launch it. Would be like.
What about when I had the code in the Node app that restarted the database and wiped it and refreshed it every single time I deployed?
I mean, I don't know that it didn't restart the database. It just dropped all the tables and recreated them. So yeah, we could do that. And then every time we deploy, we get a new, stateless development.
Stateless app. Yeah. Cool. Interesting. I would love to get this, I would love to get just this little test app that we're building to the point where it's like as close to that as possible, where it's like you could even see that as one thing. I don't know what that would look like, but
I mean, that's definitely one of the benefits of Mirage development is I don't consider that a second app. I consider that part of the front end.
Right.
Much like
the
database. The database
Yeah.
is part of the back end.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yep.
be interesting
Yep.
what that workflow would be like.
Right. Pretty cool.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm trying to think the use effects stuff I learned. I was going to see if like I was meant to brainstorm and see if there was kind of some lessons for our Ember development there, because of the way the React community is treating side effects and state. I guess one kind of interesting takeaway that I do think is relevant is I'm starting to understand more of the motivation behind the design of hooks, whereas I understood the composability argument, but I didn't understand some other aspects of it. In React with components, the same way with class components, similar to class components in Ember, you would often use things like did insert element will destroy. In React, it's component will mount, component did mount, component will unmount to set up side effects. So let's say you wanted to set up a subscription to a WebSocket. And in Ember, you might do that in an initializer of your app. I think I did that in that app I was working on. Or you might do it in like an init function on an application controller or something like that. But recently, you would probably try to encapsulate it in a component where you can just drop a component in. Let's say you have like you're building Slack, and once you click on a channel, maybe when the route activates, in the template, you could just say like subscribe to like channel equals model.id. And that's a really cool thing because that actually solves some of the same problems that hooks does. So because you're doing it in the template, which is what we always talk about, it's inherently declarative, which means it's also reactive. So if you were to do something in like, let's say you did something in channel route activate or set up controller, and you say new WebSocket to backend with channel ID model.id. Now the user navigates from general to water cooler, and you wrote that code in setup controller, which happened when the route was first entered. But when you switch the model, that code doesn't run again. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you just by design happen to put it in a component that says subscribe to channel, curly subscribe to channel, ID equals model.id in the template, you actually just took care of the case where the model changes.
Yep.
Which is pretty awesome.
Yep.
Like that's really cool.
Yeah. You get that declarative rendering. Now it does. So maybe this is where you get into like the hook stuff, but it does leak a little where if you do it in did insert element and the component stays rendered.
Yes.
Now
so
you have to adjust for it in like did receive address.
Yes. So this is exactly the point. So that works assuming it's a well-behaved component. It's a well-implemented component. And so what I mean by that is you're at least a little bit better off just by running this code in setup controller, because now when the ID changes, model.id changes, model.id changes, which means at least the component will always have the latest ID.
Yep.
So if the component did something like renders the ID in a template, boom, you're good. Or let's say you were using an observer and you had it as a function of observes ID, boom, that will always run. Of course, we don't use observers much these days in Ember. What we do is we set up things in did insert element and tear them down and will destroy. So to your point, you get the new ID, but if you didn't write anything to handle it, then you're, up the creek or whatever. But the refactoring is nice because it leaves the caller the same. So the cool thing is at least you nailed the API on the calling side. So now what you do is did receive adders, and you account for the fact, did the ID change? If so, let's unsubscribe from the previous channel and subscribe to the new one. And then on will destroy, you unsubscribe. So from the calling side, that's really cool to be able to do that. Now, basically, one of the benefits of using the way hooks are designed, in particular the use effect hook for this kind of thing, is that it nudges you to not forget those things. So I could probably open up EmberMap's code base and find some components that do something and don't properly update when the data changes or properly tear down an effect that was created. Probably.
100%.
Because there's a lot of times you would just never even know it. There's nothing about the tooling telling you it. There's no work. There may not even be a user flow that exposes the bug that's possible in your application, and yet there is a cleanup that hasn't happened.
Exactly. I think that is a big point, that there are some apps we build where you render a component. Those, like, there's no way for that.
Let's say you're in the
value to
application
change.
template.
Yeah.
You render the component, set something up. Like, technically, the thing should have a cleanup, even though it's used in the application template, which is always rendered. What about the first time you reuse that in another place, right? You move it from there and it needs to be cleaned up. So you have a welcome screen where it's not rendered. Now you have a bug. So part of the argument for the design of hooks is that fundamentally they are going to nudge you in a better direction. This actually leads me to one of the things we had on the list, which was Mixonic. Matthew Beal had a great tweet where he said, basically saying, senior developers, if you're mentoring juniors and they open a PR and their PR is technically correct, but you disagree with the style or the convention or how they've implemented it, don't critique the style. Go ahead and merge it and realize that is a notch in the belt of a badly designed API. It's like a tick in the corner of, like, this is where one area where the API fell down because it allowed for multiple styles of coding. And that's basically, I thought that was a great tweet, and I agree with it completely. And I think that is basically the same argument that the hooks folks are making, which is because, yes, you can wrap up imperative APIs into declarative components, but it requires that you be diligent, and there's often no feedback that you've done it the wrong way. So, for example, with a use effect hook, you would, on render, call use effect. You would subscribe to the channel ID inside of the function. And if you call subscribe and then you have to pass in an ID, first of all, just by writing that in a use effect, that effect is going to run every time the component's rendered. And so you actually will always have an up-to-date subscription. Not only just because it's going to rerun when the channel ID changes, it's actually going to rerun whenever the component changes, no matter what, even completely due to unrelated state.
Yep.
But by design, it does that so that you do not encounter those bugs. Now, what you kind of immediately discover next is like, wait, I want to unsubscribe and subscribe to this channel on every render. That's crazy. So that's where, like, the second argument to use effect comes in, which is an array of dependencies similar to computed properties in Ember. And you can, once you pass that in, first you can pass in an empty array, which tells React to only run this effect one time. But if within the effect you have something that says channel.subscribe model.id, it's going to lint error and say you didn't pass in model.id as a dependency because your effect depends on that. So that's already catching that bug where you didn't write did receive adders in the Ember component.
I have a question. Is there something about the way hooks are designed and the way use effect works that this is easier to lint against, where you couldn't lint against this in component did update and component will update and component did
receive adders or whatever?
Yeah.
Component will update and did receive adders, I guess, would be the Ember equivalent, right?
Right.
Well, I think it's the fact that you don't know what can you do in did receive adders? You can do anything you want. You're not necessarily creating a side effect.
Right.
So the whole point is that use effect is for side effects, so they can make an assumption that any code you run inside of there depends on that state. Whereas
because I could do stuff in did receive adders that might not even create a side effect, or might not create a side effect that I need to update.
Right.
And so they don't it might be silly to warn me about those things.
Right. And now did receive adders does run every time any attribute changes. So I guess if you set something up there, it would run every time the component effectively re-renders. But it's just not how we really use it. It's not really the mental model for it. There's lots of different things you could do there. And so I think it's just a more constrained API, I guess I would say.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, yes.
So that's really cool. And then there's one last part, which is like unsubscribing, which you do by returning a function. So React actually won't help you out here in a sense. It's up to you because there's such a thing as an effect that doesn't need cleanup. So I just thought that was a really interesting takeaway from the design of hooks, which is how can we make sure folks make sure that their effects are synchronized with the state that they depend on and will re-trigger if the state they depend on changes, and we can provide linting errors for them. And then if you return a cleanup function, it will get properly cleaned up as well. It's like the authoring experience is one thing. When I first heard about hooks and saw them, I was like, okay, it's the calling experience, because now it's like instead of having to render a component that might have to nest its children within it, you can just call use subscription, passing in model ID, and you're not affecting the nesting of your render function. But now I'm also seeing that the benefit falls on the authoring side because it helps you write less buggy components or hooks that have side effects. So it's pretty cool. And
Really
just
cool.
like a lesson in API design. Again, tying it back to Matt's tweet, it makes me think of libraries that we write. And, if basically, and I already realized I did this to some extent, but it's just good to hear it out loud. It's like people ask you, oh, how can I do this with Mirage? Or I'm doing it like this. Is this right? It's like, oh yeah, some people do it like this. Some people do it like that. I do it like this. It's like, can you design an API that actually makes sure there's only one right way to do it? And obviously there's a balance there. If you don't understand the problem space well enough, you could lock people into a bad abstraction without an escape hatch, and escape hatches are good. But, hooks is a very interesting, fundamentally different API for writing declarative components basically. And I just think it's really interesting.
Nice. It's really good to hear your experience actually writing these things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I remember we talked about this before. It was like,
We didn't know what
how
we were
do we
talking about.
how do we use these?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's awesome to hear that other side as well.
Definitely. I will say the part I got confused on, and I don't know if this is helpful for other people or thinking about Ember and stuff, but the effect word I think is a bit of a misnomer because, well, it's either a misnomer or a loaded term, because if I told you what's a side effect in a JavaScript app, what would you say?
Anything that happens outside of the component I'm writing. So I would say console.log is technically a side effect.
Right. But console.log doesn't need to be wrapped in use effect, right? More realistic example might be you might say network requests. Oh yeah, that sounds like a side effect.
Okay, yeah, something that can change state outside of this component.
That's pretty good. No, I was trying to
for
say,
the answer.
no, that's
you
good.
wanna hear.
I was actually trying to think if that's valid. My mental model was network requests definitely are side effects, right? It's a side effect. Maybe anything async would be one possible answer. It's like a side effect because it's like async. It's not synchronous. It's not it's out of band. It's in the Ember concurrency lingo, it's unstructured. It's not encapsulated by the lifecycle of this thing necessarily because it's async. So if you go into use effect thinking about that, and the docs even say things like network requests. So it's great, I need to render my component and get some data from a server. So use effect, right? You would be right. Okay, great. Now I need to create a to-do and save it. That's an effect. No, it's not an effect.
So that seems hard to tease apart because they're both at the end of the day they're both network requests.
Yeah.
One's a fetch, one's a post.
So you actually can write the post as a side effect of some state being changed, where you create save, and let's say you set some state that's intend to save post true. Oh, okay. And then you have a side effect that's like, if I ever see intend to save post true, then trigger this network request.
So this would be like having an Ember observer.
It's basically like an observer.
It seems bad.
So basically, use effect is almost like an observer, where the mental model you want is not like, is this thing async, or is it a network request, or is it what I normally think of as a side effect? It's, does something need to happen as a result of rendering that's not rendering? So when you boot a React app or Ember app, you render things to the screen in the form of elements to the DOM. If anything else needs to happen as a result of that, it's a side effect.
Wait. It's a use effect side effect?
Yes, it's a use effect side effect.
But then why, but submitting a new to-do would qualify as that, wouldn't it?
No, because it's the result of action, like a user action. It's not like something that rendered on the screen that caused it.
It's not the result of the render.
Exactly. It's not
a
like
result.
triggered
That's
by
like
the render.
the result of the submitting the form.
I think it's close. Yes, exactly.
And
I
that
think
could be handled in a handle submit or whatever.
Exactly. Which is why you can understand why you could model it as an effect. Like if saving did a loading spinner, then you could say, oh, if I ever see a loading spinner here, here's the effect I need to run. But that's like a little unnatural in my opinion.
It seems like a lot of indirection.
Yeah, a lot of indirection.
And hard to debug.
Feels like Ember observers, which and all the problems that came there, which is like if I have 3 observers that run off of the spinner, now I don't know which order they're in. Like I don't have. It's the whole reason we moved away from like two-way binding and observers and opted in for like a one-way data flow thing that had more control. So that is a similar kind of thing where you can have multiple use effects that are synchronized with the same piece of state via that dependency array. But now, like, especially if they're async, then like it could make your program more unpredictable. So yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. But as far as like the case of like fetching data, also like they kind of said fetching data is kind of fundamentally different from like posting data, which is kind of interesting. Like on the one hand, you're like, no, they're the same. They're both network requests. On the other, it's like, oh, actually, when you think about these categories, one is a result of a render and one is like a result of fundamentally of like a user event.
Yeah, I'm rendering this component that needs this data.
Yeah.
Therefore, like I've declared my data needs, therefore I'm going to go fetch them.
Yeah.
And yeah, the render is actually the thing that triggered that. So yeah, that's
pretty
really
interesting,
nice.
right? And like also the data fetching component that we played with in Ember, it's like a load records component. It's not like a save records component. It actually kind of doesn't really make sense in some ways. Like now you could have like a resource component that yields an action or something like that and has some state associated with that, which was trying to do with hooks, basically like is saving. But it does in some ways, if you apply this to the Ember template stuff, like load records makes a lot of sense and like save records doesn't out of the box.
Yeah, it's like if is saving, render this like save record component, and it's like, yeah, that doesn't feel good.
And like actions feel great in Ember. Like when you have an action that's just like model.validate, then model.save, then transition to. Like I've never felt a need to pull that into like a template necessarily, right? Whereas data loading, it's like all we want to do is get into a template because it needs to synchronize with state like the URL and like things that the user's doing.
Awesome. So that's a really good little test there. Like this thing should be pulled into a component because it's a result of rendering this component.
Yeah.
Really cool.
So we need to keep thinking about that. But like maybe that's a good actual, like maybe you don't need components for everything. Like a load component, I'm convinced is a great idea, but maybe like the other stuff. And this is why I love having services in Ember that within an action. I've never used an action. I've never wired up an action in Ember and felt like I am missing a primitive, right?
Yes.
You have like an action, even if it's like a complex action. Whereas like rendering is like super complex and you wish you had like, yield blocks, like named blocks. You wish you had better composition patterns, but like an action is actually pretty good, right?
Yes. Yep.
It's like an action, does some things, like sets some state, and then now you're back to the world of rendering, which is like the main part of the problem, I guess, right?
Yep.
Anyway, it's pretty interesting though. So yeah, it's just cool too, seeing the patterns carry across the paradigms, like, and folks thinking similarly about these things. Pretty interesting stuff. I made like we have to get going here pretty soon, but I made I wanted to be able to resort the things. It's hard in React as well. So just you can sleep well knowing I was like, oh, I'm in this blissful world, right, where there's 30 times as many developers working on this. So clearly there's going to be a drop-in solution. It's rough.
Reordering.
Rough. And I thought it was me, and then I confirmed it was not me. So a little bit of vindication there. Maybe we just need to wait for some better APIs in the browser, but yeah. All right. Well, enough rambling for now. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to be reaching out to some folks soon and try to get some interviews on, in particular, folks who have worked with both Ember and React, because I'm just very interested by this, and or Ember and then now use Vue. And I would love to just talk about some of these higher level things. So hopefully we'll have an interview coming up soon on that.
Nice.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
See ya.